Alright, so cool. I'm live. So this is the new streaming setup. Nathan helped me figure out how to install a proper streaming software so I can probably hang out a lot longer here while we film and you guys can actually watch my streams through. So we're gonna be going over week 2 in its entirety. Week 2 was actually pretty short here. Normally my notes for a week are like 8 pages long, but here, will it tell me? Oh, I guess this is 9 pages, never mind. But it's only 42 slides. So let's go ahead and get started. Man. Can't tell if this is going well or not. I need to bring my cross-reference phone. Oh, I guess this is 9 pages. Never mind. Okay, so you guys can't see my screen. So let's see how to. Okay, that should be. That should have fixed it. Okay, that should be. Okay, well, I'll give it one more test here. That should have fixed it. All right, cool. We're golden. So respiratory system, learning objectives. Let's go over these. Describe Dalton's law and Henry's law and how they relate to external and internal respiration and the amounts of oxygen and carbon dioxide dissolved in plasma. So Dalton's law is that really easy one that's just that, air is composed of multiple gases. All the partial pressures of each gas will equal all the total pressure of the gas. So that one's easy. Henry's law. Oh yeah. So Henry's law just describes how well gases can dissolve in liquid, and how it's directly proportional to its partial pressure. And that's important because carbon dioxide dissolves into our blood a lot easier than oxygen does. So that we'll probably get into that later. And overall, just that. And in the homework assignment, we talked about how increasing the partial pressure of oxygen helped oxygen dissolve into liquid into our blood better. So that's Henry's law. Considering external respiration, describe oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration gradients and net gas diffusion across the respiratory surface. That's pretty simple, just like oxygen is higher on the outside, so it's going to go inside. Carbon dioxide is higher on the inside, so it's going to go outside. It's just that simple gas exchange and diffusion. And explain how partial pressures affect diffusion. This partial pressure thing just describes how these gases act independently for diffusion. So just because there's a lot of oxygen outside, a lot of pressure outside, these gases are still able to diffuse, independently. Describe the mechanisms of ventilation, perfusion, coupling. Here, let's look that up. Ventilation perfusion coupling is a relationship between ventilation and perfusion represented by ventilation. Ventilation and perfusion refers to the efficiency of airflow, and it's crucial for optimum gas exchange. This process ensures the right amount of air reaches the alveoli where oxygen can be absorbed in the carbon dioxide. So this is basically like the coupling, as in they both have to be doing well in order for you to receive the proper amount of oxygen. Like, for example, let's say you were getting good ventilation, but you didn't have good perfusion. You would not have a lot of oxygen. You would get hypoxia. But if you had bad ventilation and a good perfusion, you would still not be getting enough oxygen. So the coupling, ventilation perfusion coupling, just refers to that general topic, that they both need to be efficient and they both be working well. So another way you can think about this is conducting airways, whether they are efficient, and also gas exchange areas, whether they're efficient or not. Respiratory areas, I should say. Considering the internal respiration, describe oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration gradients across body tissue, capillary surface. All right. This is kind of like the same thing as what I mentioned before. There's going to be more oxygen in the blood, and it's going to diffuse into body tissues. And there's going to be more carbon dioxide in the tissues that are just going to diffuse into the blood. And this is happening at the capillaries during internal respiration. And again, partial pressures, these just act independently from each other, these gases. Explain the factors that maintain oxygen and carbon dioxide gradients between blood and tissue cells. Okay. Hold on, I'm eating a little snack here. All right, so describe the different ways in which oxygen is transported in the blood and discuss the relative importance of each to total oxygen transport. So oxygen is primarily transported in the blood through hemoglobin, and those 4 irons that hemoglobin can carry. Oxygen binds to those 4 irons, and but it can also be transported in the plasma of our blood, the liquid portion. However, as I mentioned before, oxygen does not dissolve into the liquid very well, so that's only a very small amount of the total oxygen transport that's going on. So oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. So the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve just kind of depicts at different stages or uh, different people how well their hemoglobin is being saturated with oxygen. So out of those four irons that can bind to oxygen, how many of them have oxygen? And for all your hemoglobin. So that's what that saturation curve is referring to. List factors that shift the curve and explain how its results. Uh, this results in changes to oxygen binding and delivering. So oxygen has the more oxygen the hemoglobin carries, it has a greater affinity for more oxygen. So that's how whether or not you're picking up oxygen can actually affect um, your total affinity for oxygen. And and yeah, well, I guess we'll get into that into better detail. Describe the oxygen fetal hemoglobin saturation curve and its impact on oxygen delivery to fetal tissues. Um, I'm trying to remember this one off the top of my head, but it's not. I'm not gonna get it. It's curved to one way because they have to be super efficient because they're not breathing in air; they're breathing in the tummy. So theirs is a little different. Describe the ways in which carbon dioxide is transported in blood and discuss the relative importance of each to total carbon dioxide transport. So carbon dioxide is actually more dissolvable in liquid, so it there's a greater concentration of it in your plasma than there is in for oxygen. But carbon dioxide is also getting picked up by your hemoglobin, and yeah. All right, so clinical relevance, measuring respiratory volumes. So inspiratory reserve volume measures how much you can breathe in. And notice here, you can see my cursor. The tidal volume. It's above the tidal volume. So here's your normal breath. This is your normal breathing in. Inspiratory reserve volume is past that. What is past a normal inspiratory breath? You know, tidal volume is just how much when you're quietly breathing, how much are you pushing in or how much are you pushing out. Expiratory reserve volume is the same thing. How if you were to force yourself to blow as much air out, um, it would only count past what you normally would do, how much you normally would push. And residual volume here, it's a weird way to depict it, but it's just what stays in your lungs and what's not moving. And that can be because it's it's in like the trachea or non-functional alveoli, and air is just trapped there. So our inspiratory capacity measures how much you can inspire here. So that actually records the tidal volume and the inspiratory reserve volume. Functional residual capacity. I don't know why that would be be expiratory reserve volume and residual volume. Anywho, vital capacity is how much you can breathe in and how much you can breathe out. And total lung capacity measures everything that is in your lungs, all of it. So that's easy to remember. Here, we'll look up functional residual capacity right now. Oh, wow, there you go. Functional residual capacity is the volume of air remaining in the lungs after a normal passive exhalation. Oh, okay. So it's not actually All right, so residual volume is that air that's stuck, and but of course there's still some air in your trachea. I'll have to ask about this just because I'm not 100% sure here. Here, I'll just look it up. Residual volume, get a clear answer. Is the amount of air that remains in the lungs after a maximum exhale. Oh, okay. So after a maximum exhale, this is like the air that you cannot move. And functional residual capacity is just the air that remains in your lung after a normal exhale. Because after, in quiet breathing, you're not exhaling all your air. Okay, I get that a lot better. Sorry if that was confusing to you all. So the FVC, I don't know what that is. Let's go to the next one. Forced vital capacity. So that is how much you can exhale. Forced expired volume in 1 second. Peak expiratory flow rate. Total lung capacity. All right, so here we can see, so forced vital capacity is how much you can blow out. Here we can follow this line. It's being set right here. So this is how much this person is able to blow out. So that's your forced vital capacity. How much can you blow out? Yeah, and your forced expiration volume in 1 second is, it might seem odd, but it's because when we expire, when we're breathing out, the most amount of oxygen that's being breathed out is within the first second. Here we can see this curve, how much on the second graph, most of the air being expired is during this first second. So that's why it would be a clue to lung health. Because at first I had trouble understanding why do we care about it in the first second when we're expiring all this other air over here. And it's because that's where the peak expiratory flow rate is going to be. So that's the next term here. So that's just like them showing us how strong that first second is, because that first second is where it counts. So the peak expiratory flow rate is just showing the maximum amount of air you're flowing at that FEV point. So the TLC is total lung capacity, as we know, and the residual volume is how much is left after a normal expiration. So here we can see that here. So we see so someone has breathed out, but there is still 2 liters of air still within their lungs. And it looks like their total lung capacity here is 6. Because this graph is going inwards. The zeros for the y-axis. Okay, cool. So clinical notes: tuberculosis, emphysema, asthma, and cystic fibrosis. Tuberculosis is caused by a bacterium and is airborne, spreading droplets. So 13 billion people in the U.S. have inactive tuberculosis. So a lot of people have this, and it's treatable with antibiotics. And it's the granulomas produced by the bacteria kill respiratory tissue and decrease surface area for gas exchange. Okay, and lung tissues become fibrotic and decrease lung compliance. Okay. Emphysema. Here, let me look at my notes just to remember which one is obstructive and which. I don't think I noted it, but it's a good time to just look back and see. All right, so spirometry is used to figure out lung capacities. So residual volume here refers to bronchioles, everything that's conducting and conducting airway, and also dead air. Yeah, so that's what that residual volume is about. So tuberculosis, treatable with antibiotics. Emphysema, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Chronic exposure to inhaled smokes or irritants caused by release of enzymes. Okay. Chronic exposure to inhaled smoke or irritants cause release of enzymes or alveolar macrophages. Um, so it release trypsin, which is the enzyme that's destroying tissue. So if someone has a antitrypsin deficiency, then they would then these enzymes would run rampant and just destroy lung tissue. So lungs become less compliant, lowers the intrapleural pressure since airways, lowers the intrapleural pressure, and that's because the cavities are becoming bigger. Uh, and as we know, once it's bigger, the pressure drops. Makes airways more likely to collapse during exhalation. And alveoli walls break down, decreases surface area to area of respiratory membrane. So yeah. Asthma is extra mast cells in airway tissues release cytokines which trigger muscle contractions of the bronchus of bronchioles. Airway hyperresponsiveness, smooth muscles, and more mast cells. So cystic fibrosis increases mucus production and inflammation in lungs. Increased mucus increases bacterial growth in lungs. Structural damage and fibrosis result. All right. Here I know some notes on that. Yeah, so this is cystic fibrosis. Not, I don't think we need to know this, but cystic fibrosis stems from the improper chloride channels, which is what brings water outside and makes the mucus watery. But this time the mucus is not getting enough water, and it's getting harder and accumulating, so it's not being watered down and washed away. So that's what is causing the inflammation in the lungs and also increasing bacterial growth, since that mucus that is normally being washed away is now a hub for bacterial growth. All right, so restrictive versus obstructive lung diseases. So emphysema, fibrosis. I don't know. This is actually something I completely forgot about, so it's good that we're going over it. Okay, so restrictive is reduced lung volume. Okay. And obstruction is hyperexpanded lungs. So we know that emphysema is a obstructive and it says that it should be decreasing lung volume. So let's look at this. So emphysema is obstructive here. Okay, so we're gonna skip that just because I do not have a good understanding on it, and I don't feel like covering it if I'm gonna get stuff wrong. But I'll go over it with Sam, and I'll make another video about it. So, four processes of respiration: pulmonary ventilation, inspiration, expiration, external. I'm just gonna go over that just because I feel like this is pretty cemented and it's pretty intuitive that we first get in the air, exchange it, bring it to their tissues, and diffuse it there. So gas exchange occurs between the lungs. Uh, so yeah, okay. So here we can see a better look at what's going on at the alveoli and at the tissues, and just the differences between gas exchange. Right. So here we can see in the external respiration, some oxygen is being dissolved into plasma, but a lot more is being dissolved into our hemoglobin. And we can see here also that how much CO2, there's only been a little bit of CO2 that's being released from the plasma, but most of it is from the hemoglobin. So again, just note the fact that the hemoglobin is what's going to be carrying the most of the oxygen and carbon dioxide, and it's the plasma that's not going to be doing so much, but it is capable of carrying both. All right, so here we go. A ton of the oxygen is being released, as we can see from the size of the arrow, is being released from the hemoglobin, and only a little bit is being released from the plasma. And we can see here how much is being released into the plasma CO2 is, and how much is being put onto the hemoglobin, how much CO2. And again, here we see, here's just a reference back. We see two arrows versus one arrow here of stuff that's in the plasma. And that again just shows how CO2, because of Henry's law, is more, CO2 can dissolve easier into plasma and liquids. All right, so gas laws to know and love. So Boyle's law. What is Boyle's law? Is Boyle's law just, yeah, okay. Boyle's law is pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to its volume, which we know. Charles' law. Volume of gas is proportional to its temperature. So if you squish things, they get, I don't know. Oh, right. This is kind of like a steaming pot or a kettle. It'll take up more space once it's hot. It'll take up less space when it's cool. So Dalton's law of partial pressures. So we kind of went over this already. I showed you guys the equation. So oxygen will diffuse from high to low to partial pressure. At high altitudes, partial pressures decline, resulting in lower oxygen content by volume. Right, so Henry's law. The concentration of gas in liquid is directly proportional to the solubility and a partial pressure of that gas. Henry's law. Oh, so yeah, Dalton's law is different from Henry's law, sorry. So the concentration of gas in a liquid is directly proportional to the solubility and partial pressure of that. So the greater the partial pressure of the gas, the greater number of gas molecules that will dissolve in the liquid. Okay. So the higher the partial pressure, the more it'll be soluble. At equilibrium, partial pressures in the two phases will be equal. Amount of each gas dissolved depends on solubility. So CO2 is 20 times more soluble than water. As temperature of liquid rises, solubility decreases. That's pretty interesting. I'd figure that it would increase. This is another note that I'll have to ask about Henry's law. While I understand that CO2 is more soluble in water, and my question is why. since CO2 is less abundant in air than oxygen. So that's why I'm confused by that. Might be because of their chemical structure. So Henry's law, here if we make an artificial environment from this, here you can see this iron lung. Artificial oxygen, inject it, it increases the partial pressure, which makes it more soluble, which allows your plasma to carry more oxygen and deliver more oxygen to your bones. So use pressure to dissolve more oxygen in blood, used to treat heart disorders, CO poisoning. Yeah. So partial pressures, yeah, atmospheric gases. So the number one is going to be nitrogen. For those who took microbiology, I kind of remember that by thinking about how nitrogen is the limiting factor of bacteria. If you got no nitrogen, then you're not going to grow. Oxygen is number two. Carbon dioxide is way down there. And all these, if you add them up, add to 100%. So here you can see the partial pressures in mercury in 1 atmosphere. Composition and partial pressures of alveolar air. So there's a difference here between alveolar and atmospheric, and the reason is because alveolar air mixes in with old air. So let's look. So it'll have less oxygen because it's mixing in with old air that has already been robbed of oxygen, and not only that, some of the oxygen is going to dissolve into the water that's lining your trachea on the way down. So here we have some water, and the water goes way up, the water vapor, and that's because it has to be very humid at your alveolar air to protect your body. What are some other things we can note? Carbon dioxide is way higher, and that's because air is being diffused out of it at the alveoli, so that makes sense. And here we can see how this gradient is going to push carbon dioxide out, which is cool to see that going on there. This partial pressure 20 is going to go to the 13, so it's lower, and the 5 is going to go to the 0.04. All right, cool. So how do these laws affect alveolar gases? Alveoli contain more CO2 and water vapor than atmospheric air because of gas exchange in lungs. O2 will diffuse out of the alveoli, and CO2 will diffuse into the alveoli. So that should help to make sense of why there's a difference between them. Communication of the air, of connecting passageways, mixing of alveolar gas with each air. Okay, so that's kind of basically what I said. Diffusing of gases. External respiration. External respiration involves the exchange of O2 and CO2 across respiratory membranes. Partial pressure gradients of gas. Yeah, so this is stuff I've already covered here. All right, so this is external respiration. So venous blood in the capillaries. So blood that's returning to the lungs to get filled up with oxygen again is 400 millimeters mercury. Alveolar full of oxygen has 104, so there's a 60 millimeters mercury difference there. So the partial pressure differences are very high, and that's because oxygen doesn't like to diffuse, and so that's why we got to make a really big gradient for it to diffuse sufficiently to sustain us. And carbon dioxide does not need that much of a partial pressure difference because it's so much more soluble in plasma. so we can get away with that. However, oxygen does not like to dissolve in oxygen in fluid, so that's why we that's why there's a huge difference there between the 40 versus 104 and the 45 versus 40. So direction diffusion, you guys know. External respiration involves the exchange is influenced by partial pressures, thickness. Oh wow, large total surf total surface area of alveoli is 40 times the surface of the skin. It's pretty crazy. It seems that pulmonary perfusion coupling is a lot more sophisticated than I thought. So I'm gonna take a photo of this and I will go over it again in another short video. I'll bring it into SAP and help me tell him to make it make sense. So yeah, I'm trying to see what's relevant and important here. Homeostatic imbalance. Certain pulmonary disease drastically reduce alveolar surface area. So with not enough surface area, there's going to be less gas exchange. Example, in emphysema, walls of adjacent alveoli are broken down. And okay, so remember, emphysema is that trypsin enzyme. Yeah, is that trypsin enzyme, and people who have antitrypsin deficiencies, basically, and that trypsin is released in response to inhaled smoke or irritants that bring out alveolar macrophages and, try to clean up. And alveolar chambers enlarge tumors, mucus, inflammatory material can also reduce surface area by blocking gas exchange. Effective thickness of respiratory membrane increases dramatically if lungs become more. Okay, I also got to take a photo of this. I don't know what this is trying to tell me. All right, so internal respiration. So here we see a large gradient in oxygen again, and we know why. In carbon dioxide, it's still low. We know which direction it's going. All right, so here we can just go over this. Here we're nearing the end. So we have here inspired gases. So we inspire a ton of oxygen and a little bit of carbon dioxide, and again, and that's just because that's the atmospheric air concentrations. Alveoli, the oxygen is going down because it's mixing in with the old air. It's getting diffused into water, and it's mixing in, yeah. And it's going to be getting diffused into the blood, so it's just going to be lower than the outside. And CO2 is going to be higher because it's being diffused out from the blood. So in the capillaries here, we see that it's drops a little bit, but it stays relatively the same, which just demonstrates how well it can diffuse. Tissues, everything flip-flops. Low oxygen, high carbon dioxide. It's interesting to see here how the difference between, It goes from 40 to 45. I mean, the blood, the tissues have 45 millimeters of mercury, and that's just such a small difference that that's just what we need compared to the shifting oxygen levels. I just think that's interesting. Transpiratory respiratory gases. Remember, cardiovascular and respiratory system work together, both working with the nervous system to maintain homeostasis. So, cardiovascular system maximizes perfusion, which is gas delivery. Where is the most of the oxygen in our blood? It is in the red blood cells. Hemoglobin binds 4 oxygen molecules at a time. Here's the 4 irons that I mentioned before. Here is the saturation curve. Affinity depends on partial pressure of oxygen in the environment. Blood leaving the lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is around 100% saturated. So you notice how when it's returning to the lungs after dropping off its oxygen, it's still at 75. You would think it'd be at 0. This is where that affinity thing comes in place, where you need to have those oxygens because it'll help grab oxygen. It'll just make the process more efficient. Because otherwise, if it were to have if it was 0% saturated, it wouldn't pick up oxygen at the lungs capillaries as efficiently. So that's what the partial pressure. That's what the affinity is representing. Release during rest. So yeah, only 25%. But that's during rest. At 75 is when everything is being dropped off. Oh, sorry. So 75% of the oxygen is reserved, and that's for emergencies, for rough exercise. Overall, just to have, just as a reserve. Hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. The affinity of hemoglobin for O2 is influenced by hemoglobin composition in the environment, relative partial pressures, blood pH, and presence of 2,3 biphos. Anyways. So here we see how fetal hemoglobin has an increased affinity, and that's because they have to have more they have to collect oxygen better because they're not breathing in air. It's all coming through a middleman of their mother. So things that increase affinity is higher pH, less 2,3-DPG, less CO2, and lower temperatures. Things that decrease affinity are higher temperatures, which is interesting because I can almost feel that. I feel like I can breathe so much better when it's colder here. So it's kind of funny. Oh, okay. So this is the carbon dioxide thing. So where is most of the oxygen in our blood? It's in erythrocytes. So yeah, hemoglobin binds 4 at a time. CO2 diffuses into plasma, which is converted into plasma. So here, let's figure out what this is so I can refer to it. Is bicarbonate. So because we want the CO2 partial pressures to be low, we want them to be low so that they can exchange gases well. We do this by changing CO2 to bicarbonate so that the partial pressures are unbothered by it. Because since it's a different compound, it won't diffuse with CO2, even though it's a derivative of CO2. So bicarbonate diffuses into plasma to keep partial pressures low, to make sure that more CO2 will diffuse out of the tissues. Awesome. So yeah, here I'll explain it with this little diagram. So here we have lots of CO2, and it's obviously gonna from our tissues. So this is internal respiration. So it's all gonna go into our blood, and once it's all going into our blood, the problem would be that that it would reach an equilibrium, and we wouldn't be letting go of all the CO2. But we want to. This is waste product and it's acidic. We want to get rid of it. So the way that your body keeps that CO2 low in the veins, in the capillaries, is by converting it into bicarbonate. And that bicarbonate reaction is going to happen on the hemoglobin. So here, if we zoom in, we can see the CO2 plus water turns it into bicarbonate. Oh wait, no, turns it into something else. What is H2CO3? What is H2CO3? Carbonic acid. So carbonic acid, Sam explained this to me. It goes from carbonic acid to bicarbonate, but it's not carbonic acid. I mean, it's not. Oh yeah, it's not carbonic acid for a long time. It's a middleman here, but it's not as stable as the other two. So yeah. What's so carbonic acid versus bicarbonate? I'm trying to think of a mnemonic here for the H2CO3 and the HCO3. Because bicarbonate and carbonic are too alike for me. Maybe I'm gonna commit to memory bicarbonate being the bi to CO2. So it would be on the other end of the equation here, and carbonic acid would be in the middle. So we have CO2 bicarbon, as in, farewell carbon. It's going to be on the other side. So carbonic acid and bicarbonate. Okay. That's what I'm going to stick with. So yeah, what regulates respiratory rate and ventilation? Neural circuits in the brain. So medulla oblongata and pons initiate and regulate breathing. This makes sense because the medulla oblongata is kind of responsible to communicating with the whole body, since it's connecting to the spine. And the pons, from previous videos about the brain, I talked about how the pons look like lungs, like they're kind of bulbous. So that's how I remembered that. Receive information from the brain and the brainstem, because the pons relays with the higher cerebral stuff. So how you can make yourself think into breathing more. So chemoreceptors like CO2, O2, and pH. So So yeah, so aortic and carotid body. So hypothalamus, emotional state, and body temperature can make you breathe harder or less hard. Cerebral cortex, it controls voluntary breathing. All right, so is breathing regulation more sensitive? What regulates respiratory rate? Much more sensitive to high CO2 than low O2. So your chemoreceptors in your brain are for CO2, not O2, which is why it's a bad idea to hyperventilate, because if you get a lot of air in and get rid of all your CO2, you might run out of oxygen before you get high in CO2. And your body won't tell that it's low in oxygen. Okay, so let's look at my notes. Obstructive versus restrictive. Obstructive is how fast air can move through the airways, and restrictive is decreased lung volume. So that makes sense. So like an obstruction in the road would make you slow down. So how fast air can move. And that's like when airways collapse, when air gets trapped, which increases residual volume. And restrictive is just decreased lung volume. So partial pressure of gases. Okay, so the only thing is that we got to know is the numbers. Tidal volume is 500. So that is how many millimeters of mercury that's being exchanged in quiet breathing. And I remember 500 because tidal is spelled with 5 letters. See that? TIDAL, 5. Inspiratory reserve volume is 3,100 in 1900. It's a pretty big difference. Expiratory is 1,200. Residual volume is pretty interesting. So I'm just looking at these numbers now, just trying to get a overview here. Vital capacity, CV, RV, ERV, not excluding our residual volume is 480. Okay. So yeah, I guess I just have to look at these very often and and just commit them to memory. Okay, so I think that's gonna be it for today's stream. Thank you guys for watching. This was a little bit more of a rougher stream just because I didn't know 100% of all the stuff. So yeah, but I took photos, and now we're going to be able to, I'll make another video once I go over all those things that I didn't know. Otherwise, I felt pretty confident in the rest of the material, but there, there was those things about the coupling and obstruction versus restrictive, and also why CO2 was more dissolvable in water, and also what else? The just remembering the volumes is something else I'll have to do, and remembering all those disease, pulmonary diseases, which are emphysema, asthma. Yeah. Oh, cystic fibrosis and tuberculosis. So tuberculosis is gonna increase volume. Yeah, I'll have to ask which ones are obstructive and restrictive, but that's about it. Okay, now that I've got my homework and you guys have listened to someone studying, then we should be all good and wrapped up. Anyways, okay, thank you guys for watching.